My name is Teddy Sami. I'm the director and professor here at the Norman Paterson School. Today's hybrid session is organized by the Africa Study Group as a partnership with NIPSIA and the Continental African Diaspora Scholars Network Canada. So a warm welcome to you all, and as well as those who are joining us online. I'd like to first acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We take this time to show our gratitude and respect to all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples for their past and present contributions to this land, and we recognize our collective responsibilities to the land and the water. This acknowledgement should not function as closure, resignation, or acceptance of the past or present, but should also inspire and support learning about the true history of this country, and it should provoke thought, reflection, and positive change. As you would have seen in the announcement that was sent to you for this session, we are going to look at the Canada-Africa strategy today, which is with a subtitle of the document as a partnership for shared prosperity and security. Comme beaucoup d'entre vous le savent déjà, le Canada a lancé sa première stratégie mondiale pour l'Afrique le 26 mars dernier. Le 6 mars dernier, je crois. Cette stratégie inclut 5 domaines stratégiques qui sont alignés sur l'agenda 2063 de l'Union africaine. Et elle a vu le jour avec plusieurs consultations avec des parties prenantes, tant au niveau canadien qu'africain et international. If you read the Canada-Africa strategy document that was released in March of this year, you will see that it aligns itself with Agenda 2063 of the African Union, and it came out after many months of consultations with stakeholders in Canada, in Africa, and as well as internationally. The document has 5 main pillars, if you will, namely strengthening diplomatic engagement and people-to-people ties, enhancing economic cooperation, reducing poverty, supporting economic development, empowering youth, assisting in humanitarian crises and climate adaptation. The 4th one is about fostering partnerships for peace, security, and human rights. And the last one is advancing shared priorities for increased engagement on the global stage. In a few minutes, we will get a chance to hear from our distinguished panelists who will offer their reflections and perspectives on this strategy. I think some of them have already contributed in their writings and reflections already. You can see them online, but it will be great to hear from them as they are experts in their own areas of interest and can also speak about this issue from their own perspective. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce Cheryl Urban, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister for Africa and Pan-Geographic Affairs. She will offer a few remarks. And after that, our president here, Dr. Wisdom Tete, will also offer a few remarks of introduction. So the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, honorable members of the Diplomatic Corps, Dr. Wisdom Tete, Dr. Sheikh Bandura, professors, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, bon après-midi. Thank you so much for inviting me to this and to be able to speak before the esteemed panel of Africa scholars so that I can say a few words about the Africa strategy before you launch into discussions. Also, thank you to the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University and the Continental Africa Diaspora Scholars Network Canada for organizing this important event. I was saying earlier that I see many familiar faces in the room and connected online and among our distinguished panelists. It's been a little over 2 years that I've been Assistant Deputy Minister for Africa, and it has really been a privilege for me to meet and to engage with individuals who are so passionately committed to the future success of Canada-Africa relations. I'm reminded in the fall of 2024 when myself and Parliamentary Secretary Oliphant spoke at an event hosted by the Africa Study Group. And this was when I think back to that time before we launched the strategy. So I just have to say that it gives me a great deal of satisfaction to be able, a number of months later, to be in front of you and talking about the strategy that has been released. So I'm very pleased to do so. Nous voici à un moment important dans les relations entre le Canada et le continent africain. Il y a 3 mois à peine, le gouvernement du Canada a lancé à Toronto la première stratégie mondiale du Canada pour l'Afrique, intitulée un partenariat pour une prospérité et une sécurité partagée. La stratégie s'avère une mesure audacieuse visant à favoriser la prospérité économique et la sécurité commune, à la fois du Canada et des populations africaines. Elle représente un jalon important qui s'inscrit dans l'évolution et le dynamisme de nos relations vers une approche basée sur les partenariats. At its core, the Africa strategy rests on a shared understanding that a deeper, more multifaceted peer-to-peer partnership between Canada and African interlocutors is important, rooted in economic cooperation, security collaboration, leveraging our people-to-people ties, and making sure that we have a focus on our diaspora and on youth, and that this is the best pathway forward so that we have shared prosperity. As was already mentioned, the creation of the strategy was years in the making, and it included consultations with over 600 stakeholders. And a number of those who contributed are part of our discussion today. And I have to say that I believe that is a big part of the value, that this is responsive to what we heard about what was important, and it was truly informative for the Government of Canada. Central to the Africa strategy is a conviction that our actions needed to be rooted in the priorities of our African partners. And with this in mind, we renewed our engagement with the African Union last November at the second Canada-Africa Union high-level dialogue in Toronto by signing a memorandum of understanding that lays a strong foundation for the work that we are doing today. And I have to say that that moment was very important to me as well. The Prime Minister of Canada attended for a good part of the day. There was a lot of, all three ministers from Global Affairs Canada were present, and it was, in my view, what was best about that high-level dialogue is that it was truly substantive in nature, and I think it really solidified the relationship so that in the future we can move together in partnership. By committing to an approach that's aligned with the African Union's Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, we are showing in word and in deed that partnering with Africa is essential to our engagement in Africa. So just a moment on why are we doing this now, and why does partnering with African interlocutors matter for Canada and for Canada's future? Africa is quickly transforming into a hub for trade and investment. It has abundant critical minerals, and it's key to building supply chains that Canada needs. It's central to safeguarding global biodiversity. It's got the world's largest youth population. It's increasingly central to the shifting global order. And here in Canada, we have a growing Africa diaspora that is more engaged than ever. I mean, I'm preaching to the converted here. I know you guys are well aware of all of that, but it's part of the narrative is making sure that that's well understood within Canada. And speaking of the narrative, over the past couple of weeks, I had the privilege of being able to attend a number of events that were celebrating Africa Day. And there were different panel discussions, and one theme that would come back again and again was precisely about that narrative and the need for this narrative to shift. But when we are talking about engagement with Africa, rather than focusing on risk, it's a focus on mutual prosperity and opportunity. That when we look at economic partnerships, we're not simply looking at the traditional aid model, but we're looking at impact and we're looking at investment. And why does this matter now? You would have probably listened to the speech from the throne by the new government. There's a new mandate letter that's out. There is a foreign policy review that will happen and a new national security strategy. This is all, when you look at it, about strengthening Canadian sovereignty. It's about diversifying and strengthening the partnerships that Canada has around the world, and lining up what we need domestically and our agenda domestically with how we engage internationally. I really do see the opportunity for how we engage with African partners as contributing to this overall agenda, and there's a lot of possibility there. We also are going to be sitting at multilateral tables, and we've got coming up within the next week, Canada's G7 Leaders Summit in Kananaskis. And that is where Canada will take a leading role in shaping the global economic and security agenda. And of course, in this year, when Canada has the G7 presidency, South Africa has the G20 presidency, and there will be a number of G20 related ministerial events and the Leader Summit that will take place in November, and so many opportunities for Canada and South Africa to collaborate on their respective presidencies. Final note, this government has set a tone that moving forward, this is really all about getting things done and about action. And that is the spirit that we have with the Africa strategy. You will have seen that we have made already at the high-level dialogue some announcements. We've named 2 new specialists. We've created a new Africa Trade Hub at Global Affairs Canada. One of our directors general, Drew Smith, right now is in Calgary for the energy forum that's taking place, and we'll be meeting with Nigerian delegation and other African stakeholders. We are developing a diaspora engagement mechanism, and we are setting up a new trade and development nexus program. This is just some of what we're working on, but I want to emphasize that we appreciate and understand that this is a commitment to operationalization and action and implementation. So I just want to thank all of you for your contribution and the collective effort to deepen the partnerships between Canada and Africa. One of my team members, Joanne Veilleux, is joining, and she'll be staying for this whole event. One of the important things for us that's benefited is listening. So we are here today to listen to your discussion and to have that feed into what we do in the Government of Canada. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your remarks, and thanks for making the to be with us this afternoon. Without further ado, I'm now going to ask our President and Vice Chancellor of Carleton University, Dr. Wisdom Tete, to offer some introductory remarks. I'm going to move so that you can sit here and people will see you better.
They can see me from here, right?
Can they be
Yeah.
It's good now. Yeah,
Are you sure?
no worries.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
good. Thank you. Thanks, Daddy. And Cheryl, thanks for making the time to join us. I know this has been a heavy lift for you for the last little while. We've been in spaces together to talk about this stuff. So it's good to see it come to fruition. But just wanted to welcome everyone online and in person to Carleton. I think that this is one of the values of having an educational institution that focuses on engaging with matters that are pertinent to communities, not just in our region, in our locality, but around the world, is this interconnectedness that allows us to see how things that happen elsewhere resonate here, impact things that go on here. But particularly in a world that is, notwithstanding all the challenges, still very interconnected and committed to collaboration as the basic means by which we're able to push together in common cause. The role of a unit like NIPSIA is important, right? This is a number of colleagues who engage in this issue on a daily basis. And so if you're looking for ideas from people who are seized with these things on a regular basis, this is the space to find that. And I'm glad that we've been able to do this in a hybrid format that allows us to extend the benefit of the conversation beyond this particular room. Since we're academics, I assume that part of the reason why our colleagues from Global Affairs continue to engage with groups like ours is to be able to hone these things. These are not done deals. They are opportunities for us to continue to make better and to, work out any kinks that are in the system, because nothing is perfect. And if we were waiting for this thing to be perfect before moving forward with it, we wouldn't be here. And so I think we have to come to it with an understanding. And you've seen that set in other spaces where people have acknowledged that this has been a long time coming. A lot of people have done work within the government to bring visibility to this as an important focus for the government. And I think that it's important that all of us who are engaged with this are not daunted by what may not be our expectation of what it should be, but actually be galvanized in common cause to see how we might be able to support this effort and elevate it to the level that we'll all be proud of. So as we engage in this conversation this afternoon, I think it's important that we come to it with that spirit. Critique is not, a negative thing. I think that we want to be able to critique this in a productive and constructive ways so that we're able to help make it better. This is work in progress. This is work that is starting a conversation, and that conversation, as you've heard from the ADM, has already seen evidence of commitment through concrete things that have been done. But I think that colleagues would be the first to say to you, even from the government, that there's more work that needs to be done. And how we feed into that process, making sure that the advocates for this strategy within government are buoyed by what we're providing in terms of a move forward, momentum to this work. It's an important part of what we should at least, I think, as academics, members of the diaspora, take into account that this is an effort to work in partnership. And we all know if you work in different contexts where there are competing interests, that there's always going to be the need to continue to sustain the momentum and to support one another. I would leave you with setting thoughts as we engage over the course of the afternoon. And I know that people have done some work in assessing the strategy. We've heard from folks who looked at, is the fact of, just the symbolic nature of the launch and the substantive value of it, does that say anything about where this sits within the government? People would compare it to other strategies that have been launched with a lot more fanfare, and would ask the question, which I think is a justifiable question, about does this then indicate the level of commitment on the part of the government? And I think that that in itself puts a responsibility on government to be able to disabuse people's minds of that through the concrete actions that we've heard about. I think it's also worthwhile looking at whether or not this is driven by the right motivations. And you heard from the minister, and I have heard this in other contexts, there's no mincing words about the mutuality of this, right? This is not your old process, we do it all, come do it. It's been an exercise to say, how can we work with African partners to help shape the direction of this? And I think that also means that these conversations are not just happening in Canada, but are happening on the African side, where we are taking a good look at whether or not what is before us is viable, is responsive to the particular context of the Africans, and whether the African voices continue to help shape and inform the way things move. But there's no question about the fact that this is a step forward that people have looked after for a long time. And I always see these things as an obligation on the part of whoever puts this forward to be held accountable. And so the government, by putting this forward, at least gives you something that you can hold the government accountable to. In the absence of anything, it's hard to do that. So even if you look at it from that perspective, where the government has made itself open to conversations about these issues, that is a good thing for us to look at. So, I think this afternoon we'll figure out how we translate this from a strategy that may or may not go somewhere to a foundational document that goes to the fundamental essence of a relationship built on reciprocity and mutual prosperity, as its name suggests, and how we might be able to help contribute to move that effort forward. Because it's not just going to take the Canadian side, it's going to take the African partners as well. And what is important, particularly for the diaspora community, is the insertion of the diaspora as a huge, bridge space between Canada and Africa. And so again, the challenge to us as members of the diaspora is to say, how might we become catalysts for what it is that is necessary to elevate this thing to the kind of outcome that we're looking for. So, as I speak and as I look at my colleagues who are going to speak to this topic, I kind of regret that my calendar does not allow me to take in all the elements of this conversation. But the good thing is that it's going to be available, online. And so I hope that we all participate in this with the understanding that we're helping to enrich something. We're helping to move something forward. So bring all the ideas to bear on the conversation, but let's do this with understanding that critique is a valuable part of what allows us to get to a better place with ideas that, have been put forward for all of us to consider and to engage with. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. Thanks to our colleagues from NIPSIA. Thanks to the African Study Group for continuing to be, a point of connection between the academic community and the larger community on these issues that are pertinent to who we are as a society, and to make sure that policy is informed by evidence-based scholarship, and that policy is also informing that scholarship in ways that allows us then to take these things into community, because we cannot operate in isolation from the communities that are impacted by the decisions that we make. So I wish you all a great afternoon, stimulating conversations, and I'm sure you knowing who's on the panel, and looking forward to how we feed this back to our colleagues at GAP so that this work can continue to be sustained. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Tete. I will now yield the floor to Sheikh, who will moderate the discussion with our panelists. And yeah, so do you want to move to this chair or you're fine?
I'm good. I'm
You're
good
good?
here.
Yeah.
Maybe they will move a bit the camera. Merci, Eddie. Merci, Winston. Merci beaucoup, Kelly, for being here. It's an honor for us. And I know many people have been asking for this session. Now we have it. We will just the start of the discussion with the aim to implement the strategy, to acknowledge it, to salute the strategy, and to take ownership of the strategy to make it better. Because it's a strategy that is there to stay. So we will take it, we'll improve it, we will work on it, because this strategy for Canada is for Africa. I will not repeat everything that has been said. It's the first time that we have this highways webinar hosted in a triangular cooperation between the Africa Study Group, NUCIA, and the Continental African Diaspora Scholar Network, Canada. I wish we could have done this with 10 or 20 other organizations, but I'm sure it will come. It will come because this has to be done collectively. Thank you, Professor Teddy Nipsha, for welcoming us again so kindly to this beautiful Nipsha Resource Center. We are one of the organizations that actually inaugurated this center. We consider it as home to the Africa Study Group. And thank you so much for your kindness and your support. I know you are not doing this because you are a member of the Africa Study Group, a long-standing member of the Africa Study Group. I remember since 2012, 2013, I think, we met at the university. And again, thank you so much on behalf of our 350 members of the Africa Study Group and all those other colleagues, ambassadors, and Ambassador Bob Fuller, who established this organization. I have to admit that it was not easy to have this panel. Given the high profile and diversity of Canada's African diaspora and Canada-Africa experts, it was no easy task, as I say, to compose this panel. According to the Statistics Canada, Canada's African diaspora is highly educated and skilled. Its members are more likely than the general population to have obtained a university degree. In 2001, 19% of African age 15 and over were university graduates. So I'm just saying this to show how difficult it was for us to make a choice in this group of diaspora. We have very competent people. I wish I could have all those people on this panel, but unfortunately, we have only 6 people. But thank you very much for all those other people who have called me, who have sent me emails and asked to be on the panel. And I promise you, we will continue this dialogue. And we will make sure that the diaspora, member of the diaspora, we know each other. And we come together to work for Canada and for Africa. And I promise as long as I'm here as President of the Africa Study Group, we will certainly do this. Today we have 6 speakers. We have Professor Nadej Compaoré, Assistant Professor of International Relations at the University of Toronto. She will be talking to us from France. We have Professor Edward Ansa Akufo, Associate Professor of International Relations and Chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Fraser Valley, Abbotsford. He will be talking to us from Ghana, from Accra. We have Dr. Marsha Burdett, former Canadian diplomat for more than 28 years, and currently Vice Chair of the Africa Study Group. She is with us here. We have Professor David Black, the Professor of Political Sciences at Dalhousie University. We have Professor Thomas Kieku, Associate Professor of Political Science in King's University College at the University of Western Ontario, London. We have my dear sister, Dr. Adetun Admuko, Program Officer, Lead on Policy, British Columbia Council for International Cooperation, Vancouver, and she will be talking to us from Vancouver. We have tried to take our speakers from everywhere across Canada, and then we will continue doing this. The session will run for a total of 90 minutes. And we will have an 8-minute presentation by each of the 6 panelists on or around one of the 5 priorities of the Canada-Africa strategy. And then we will have 45 minutes of question and answer period. Then at the end, we will have a closing remark by the director of lecture, by Teddy. So we are trying to make it as simple as possible. People who are online, I will ask you to send your question, to write your question in the Q&A box, and then in French or in English, and then we will deal with it. Without any further delay, I will let our first speaker take the floor, and Dr. Marsha, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to Eddie, Wisdom, Cheryl, and of course to Faith. I know we're have a short period of time, so I've made very short comments, which I were hoping would help set the scene for this discussion. And the panelists, the individual panelists, will be focusing on the enhancement or enrichment part of the Canada-Africa strategy. So my comments, I'm reflecting on the Canadian government relations with Africa over about 30 years. And my comments are focused on what I think is at moment hinge politics right now. I refer to my comments as reflections because it's not a detailed analysis. I'm talking to you about my experience in government and also when I was working to support a Canadian politician in foreign affairs. My first job when I joined what we then called DFATE was the senior policy advisor to a newly created position called the Secretary of State for Africa and Latin America. They hadn't had one before in the Canadian government. They set that up, and they also had one for Asia, by the way. And Christine Stewart took that job. Prior to that date, I would say, if we were going to make a generalization, Canadian involvement with Africa had a heavy focus on development programming and also a large amount of extensive mining investment. Now, from 1993 to 2006 would be what I would sort of call a golden age for Canada-Africa government relations. And the reason I call it this is because the Liberal government was, in that time, quite interested in new partners and worldwide, including from Africa. Lloyd Axworthy was the Foreign Affairs Minister at the time, and he was a strong, forward-looking man. And he brought Christine Stewart in to be a Secretary of State for Latin America. I was part of her team. Christine was an energetic and engaged woman who traveled extensively throughout Africa, who developed personal alliances with African leaders, especially on the Commonwealth front, which is where Canada took quite a role in things like the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, which was focused heavily on African issues. So when Canada took the lead on the global effort to end the use of landmines, now that's a long time ago, but it was a major action for the government of Canada. They found, and they say the bureaucrats and the politicians working that to get enough leadership back and backing, they found that the African countries proved to be the absolute key in the global effort to end the use of landmines. And this is something long enough ago that the young generation may not know of it, but it was very much prominent in the minds of the Chrétien government at that time. And it was a great deal of support to bring what they call the Ottawa Convention into power in 1997. And the focus within foreign affairs in the capacity to gain these partnerships and the numbers that would be brought forward of African votes in various multilateral fora, the UN, the Commonwealth, La Francophonie, was not lost on the senior levels. Now, skipping over vastly, I'm just going to move to the 2002, when the Chrétien government hosted the first G7 Kananaskis Summit. This one next week is the second in Kananaskis. And that was the first G7 meeting where senior African leaders were brought into high-level global discussions. And the result was something called the Africa Action Plan. There's lots of research and debates about that, but it's important that it happened. And when I, by that time, had joined into the bureaucracy of DFATE, I started to see what was happening from the inside of the bureaucracy. One of the key people who brought forward a lot of changes and efforts was a man called Bob Fowler. He had actually been the Minister of Defense, then he went into a series of important jobs, but he advised Chrétien on foreign affairs, and he represented Canada at the UN, and he incidentally helped set up the Africa Study Group so many years ago. So in 2006, when the Harper government came into power, a lot of the interest and engagement with African nations at the senior level dropped away. And it dropped from the priority of the Canadian government, and therefore dropped in the priorities from the Department of Foreign Affairs, DFATE, as it was then known. Now we know it as GAC. Some development programming continued, including initiatives like the maternal and child health care, which brought a lot of money to Africa in the important health sector. But there was no overall strategy to link these initiatives and ideas together to develop or intensify relations with African leaders. So for approximately 20 years, there have been some efforts to re-engage with Africa and draft an Africa strategy. I worked on these for about 15 years. And these efforts died every time because of the lack of political interest by the ruling party, both conservative and liberal. And that equally, to be fair, the priorities for GAC had to be on the US, China, India, then eventually the war in Ukraine, Middle East, and sustaining relations with the European Union. The latest round to produce an Africa strategy from the outside, now I was by then quite an outsider observing, started around 2021-22. It looked as though it was going to be faced with the same fate as those prior efforts. The Africa Study Group produced a vision paper calling for a strategy. Many people in this room and online produced thoughts and arguments from academia, civil society, business, and the growing African Canadian African diaspora, lobbied persistently along with key individuals inside GAC to push along the development of a strategy, and were able to modestly increase Canadian diplomatic presence. But I would say the commitment from senior levels, bureaucratic and political, just wasn't tense enough. And even, you will recall, there was a long debate of what to call this bloody document. Now, in early 2025, the stars realign. The threats posed by the Trump administration woke up Canadians, as well as the government of Canada, as well as GAC. Suddenly, it became obvious Canada needed to intensify its relations with particularly Europe, better its relations with Mexico, find new allies, and urgently rework our internal and external economic relations. In March, the Canada-Africa strategy was announced with an important subtitle, a partnership for shared prosperity and security, the two big themes we see in the Carney government. So when the Carney government came into power with a mandate to rework the Canadian economy, deepen relations with other allies, seek new markets and investments, the new ministers have been appointed, including Anita Anand to the Foreign Ministry, and I believe Mr. Oliphant has returned as Parliamentary Secretary. And there are some important signals, one of which Cheryl pointed to earlier, which is at the upcoming G7 summit in CADSN 2, the president of South Africa, as chair of the G20, is invited. So once again, the politics realign and change. So nothing is perfect in this world, and this certainly includes the current Africa strategy. But I think to encourage the bureaucracy to deepen the strategy and actually implement its key elements. For example, it'd be great to hear more about the Africa Trade Hub. We have assembled this panel to provide ideas which can be fed into the discussion. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Marsha. C'était excellent, comme toujours. Je le dis souvent, c'est comme des bibliothèques qui brûlent. Nous avons beaucoup de nos diplomates qui sont assis à la maison et qui peuvent apporter, qui savent de quoi on parle. It's in French, we say that l'histoire est le socle du présent et de l'avenir. If you know where you're coming from, then you will master your way forward, where you're going. In order to be successful, if you have a policy document, you will be in better place to implement it if you know where the policy is coming from, if you know the history of the policy. And that's applicable also here with Africa study, with the Canada Africa study. There is a history behind it. We need to know that. We need to use that history to implement the strategy. It's very helpful. There are many things that we can say. And I would like to use this opportunity, Marsha, to thank you very much. We were both there when the Africa Study Group was created in 2006 by Bob Fuller. And I would like to thank you very much for your participation, for everything that you have been doing for this group. And we are counting on you for the future. I will go now to our second speaker, who is Professor Thomas. I understand that you spoke with Kufo, and so you are going to talk about strengthening our diplomatic engagement and people taking time.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much, Sheikh. That's right. Although I thought that Eddie will go first so that I can pretend that he has said, or he can say everything and I can just say that I don't have anything to add. But since I'm going first, so I have to pretend to put something on the table for discussion. So thank you so much. And then to the Africa Studies Group, NEPSIA, and CADSN for putting this particular thing together. I am going to talk a little bit about strengthening Canada's diplomatic engagement with the Africa continent, particularly how Canada can strengthen or deepen the peoples-to-peoples ties that lies, at minimal opinion, that lie at the heart of the Africa strategy. And I'm going to make 5 points. So the first one is that it's very important for us to recognize that diplomatic engagement, diplomacy itself, is an insurance policy, right? And I think it will be very important for us, both as Canadians and everyone, to realize that when we are engaging with the African continent, we are engaging it because we need that insurance policy, because we are a global middle power, and we can build the kind of military that others are able to build. We are also a trading state, and as a result, you need countries or institutions that are committed to rules-based international order. And Africa happens to be a place where countries respect and value the rules-based international order, and therefore it becomes a natural partner in terms of working with Africa. In other words, the point I'm trying to make is that Canada is not in Africa because of only charity. Canada is in Africa because it is our strategic interest to do so. And I think that's very important. And a good person for insurance, you don't wait until you have an accident before you activate the insurance. You create that peoples-to-peoples engagement so that in your hour of need, then you can go and then activate it. Sadly, sometimes we haven't done it that way. We wait for the accident to happen and we think about an insurance policy. We wait for Trump to come in. We wait for Ukraine to happen, or wait for our problem with China, and then we go to Africa, or when we need Security Council vote, then we go there. When you do that, it's often very...
Excuse me.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. So that's the first point that I want to say, that African countries deeply value multilateralism, rules-based international order. And when you are a global middle power, having those friends in those places, will be very important going forward. So that's the first point that I want to make. The second point that I want to make is that whilst the focus of the discussion so far on the strategy has been what is lacking and what is missing, my sense is that there are a number of, such as, people have pointed out the lack of funding, the lack of political clarity during the election. I didn't hear Africa mentioned at all, and I haven't heard Africa really mentioned prominently by the government. But I think it's very important for us to recognize what already exists and to think much more creatively as to how we can leverage what exists. And on that note, there are 2, I think, areas that the policy that I particularly like in terms of peoples-to-peoples ties. The emphasis on the creation of special envoys, and I like the idea of that. And this is where the bat is, and as an academic, we always have a bat somewhere. But these envoys, the creation of the envoys, if we don't backstop them properly, and we don't resource them with strong support structures, bureaucratic support, they will not be able to build the long-term durable relationship that we can draw upon when it matters most. In other words, it's very important for us to create these, envoys, but it's even more important to make sure that they have strong people behind them. People say that they will do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. It's also very important for us to think about creating new missions, but I would want us to approach it in a much more strategic way in terms of the position of our mission, in a much more strategic way. So, for example, I'd like us to see us, if we're really going to engage with African regional institutions, and not just only bilateral, but we're going to do a proper Pan-African kind of engagement. I'd like us to see us strengthen our missions in Addis, for example, in areas where these regional economic communities have headquarters. I'd like to see us Addis, not because of just the African Union, but people forget that the United Nations is so prominent there, and therefore we having a presence there is very important. ECA is very important. I'd like to see us, improve our presence in areas where Abidjan, people don't talk about Abidjan a lot, but I'd like to see us improve our presence in Abidjan to give it the capacity to actually work not bilaterally, but also with ADB, of which Canada is a proud shareholder. Right? So we want to make sure that. And then apart from that, I'd like us to see us, hopefully, if we're going to announce any more missions, I'd like to see one in particular in two places. One is Gaborone, not because Botswana has been an example in terms of good governance, but also SADC is headquarters there. And you want to use that one to be able to engage with the Southern African countries so that they can be heard. We don't have the capacity to have missions everywhere, and therefore where you locate is very important. Working through those regional organizations is a good way to make government where you don't have presence feel that you are hearing them. And then I like also to see us in Libreville, Gabon, not because of anything, not because of only our presence in La Francophonie, but it also gives us the chance not only to strengthen our footprint in the Francophone Africa, but also gives us the opportunity to be able to work with ECAS, the Economic Community of Central African States. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the way we have to think about it is that we need to move away from what we've traditionally done, which is follow the crowd, right? Where the Americans embrace and others they go. That's usually where we go. This time around, I think we have to be intentional in terms of our engagement. The third point, and here I'll turn the emphasis a little bit on the people-to-people dimension of the strategy. Understandably, the emphasis, the attention has focused so much on the African diaspora here on the continent, which is, I think, it's an enormous asset. I think we haven't really leveraged them really well. And I'm so glad that, for example, this event is being co-organized with the Continental African Diaspora Scholars Network. I think there's enormous opportunity for Canada to leverage that to build a stronger and durable presence on the African continent. But I also like to see us focus more on ensuring that Canadians on the African continent we draw on their strength. I'm talking about individuals living and working in different parts of African institutions and African communities who may be Canadian born and living there, but more importantly, African born but have Canadian connection. And sometimes it's surprising when you travel across the African continent, the number of people who have so much connection to Canada is amazing. Sometimes I feel that Stars Canada has not captured the population accurately, given the number of people that you often meet with Canadian connection. The point I want to make here is that although these individuals are very important, and to me, they are sometimes our best diplomat, right? Our diplomats in our missions are, just like missions everywhere, are often capital-centric. Other Canadians are often working in communities, and they are often the individuals who are the best representation of Canada. But The point here I want to make is that we need to be able to build the capacity of global affairs to be able to track and identify these individuals in the various spaces where they are working and ask me 2 questions. The first one are, where are these Canadians? Where are they working? Or what are they doing? And more importantly, how can the Canadian government amplify their impact on the ground? So doing that, I think, can help us in terms of strengthening Canadian position on the African continent. A 4th point, which is also related to the people's, unlike countries such as the United States and others where there was a conscious effort by the government to create spaces for their citizens to be on the ground, like, for example, the creation of a Peace Corps by the US that embed people's citizens in a long-term global partnership. We haven't really done that. This might be something that we may have to think about it a little bit as we go forward. I'm not saying that we should replicate it, but already we have a strong base of our public institutions, particularly the universities, already engaged and doing a lot of peoples-to-peoples diplomacy that we can leverage, that a little bit of the intentional policy we may be able to leverage it in a much more sustainable and durable way. What am I talking about? A number of our universities are already doing international experiential learning programs, sending students, especially if we're thinking about bringing the youth alongside. They are doing academic, they have internships, field schools, community engaged learning, and academic exchanges. I think it will be very important going forward for the implementation of the strategy for the Canadian government to work with the universities to strengthen this particular really. They're already doing it, so you just need to amplify it and work with them. And that would actually help in terms of scaling up these people's to people's ties. I think those are going to be very important as we move forward. And then finally, and I'll make my final point and then I'll shut up. Finally, and this is, I like the fact that the strategy is emphasizing civil society partnership, not just with government, which is really good. But it's a point of caution here a little bit. In working with civil society groups, we have to make sure that we don't do it at the expense of public institutions. I am raising this because in the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen strong donor effort to capitalize building the capacity and ensure that civil society groups or civil society organizations will do some of the work that government are supposed to do. But civil society by nature are very fragmented, donor dependent and transient, and often don't have the capacity to do the things that government are supposed to do. And we have empowered them to the extent sometimes at the expense of public institutions. And we have to be careful that Canada, we don't feed into that. Let me give you a specific example to bring this point home for you. In my area of work, research, there are a number of last 30 years, we've seen a lot of think tanks emerging on the African continent. What has happened is that they've damaged research centers of African public universities. And the research that we have actually suggests that these think tanks, while they have created visibility and enhanced the promotion of ideas, they've actually not created the condition for indigenous knowledge production. And most of the research is actually suggesting that they become the purveyors of already extant ideas and have actually crippled the ability of domestic knowledge, innovative kind of knowledge to emerge. So in the area of peace and security where I work, you see a lot of research in that area, but usually when you apply it, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's just only in most cases, they are getting the money from donors and they package them nicely. And because those ideas are already ideas that we play with, we just pick them up. And so as we try to build relations with Africa, we have to make sure there's a balance between our support for civil society groups and non-governmental organizations and our support for public institutions so that we don't kill them. Because over a long term, those are the institutions that will do the heavy lifting. Let me conclude by just going back to the point that I started with, that building a relationship with Africa is a strategic national interest. And therefore, it must be long-term, it must be mutual. And in my opinion, people-to-people ties properly nurtured, they are as vital as a trade deal or a defense pact. They are the human infrastructure that will allow Canada to weather storms and seize opportunities. And we need to be able to put more resources into nurturing it. And our diplomacy, which in my opinion is more important to me than our building any military, if you ask me, because that's the way we can have endurance. So our diplomacy, if well resourced, well located, and well informed, is our best and most reliable insurance policy. The government must not wait for an accident to happen, for us to have a problem before we go and then before we think about the insurance policy. Thank you so much.
Merci Thomas, merci Professor Keko. And I do support your idea of creating some representation of the headquarters of international sub-regional organization in Africa. And I think that's a very effective proposition, and that could help a lot, because that's where things happen. Headquarters of a regional, sub-regional organization in Africa, and then we have 8 of them. Merci, Thomas. The next speaker will be Professor Black, and he will be talking to us about enhancing economic cooperation, regional institutional development cooperation. The floor is yours, Dave.
Thanks very much, Sheikh. I'm very grateful to you and to the African Study Group for organizing this timely discussion. I also think it's very apt that it's taking place at Carleton University, which has always been a kind of fulcrum for African studies in Canada. And I always feel right from the, for the 30 years that I've been involved in this work, Carleton has always been at the forefront of these discussions. And so it's good to see it taking that role again under the leadership of President Teti. I'm going to wander a bit, perhaps, from the brief that I've been given by Sheikh, although I will circle back to it. But what I want to do is touch on four things in my remarks. One is why the strategy would elicit as much skepticism as it has done, and why it might be a focus of low expectations, why it should be a priority, and here I'm picking up on points that Thomas and others have made, even in the midst of a plethora of competing demands. And we have to remember that we're trying to win attention for this focus at a moment when there's an extraordinary array of competing demands that are in the policy ecosphere, if you like. Third, what an effective strategy would focus on, particularly as it pertains to economic cooperation and to development more broadly. So what are some of the markers that we would want to be looking towards? And then very quick comments on what should be avoided in amplifying and building on this strategy. So first of all, why this would be greeted with skepticism. And here I want to say, first of all, that the natural defense of the political scientist is cynicism and skepticism. That's because we'll always be safe if we're cynical and skeptical about new departures as they arise. This was a strategy that was launched, as Marcia has discussed, under less than propitious circumstances in a kind of a political vacuum. And one of the key questions that it gives rise to is who will be the champions for this strategy within the government as it has now taken shape. So who is going to drive this forward in the current political configuration? The other thing, and I'm picking up on some of the points that Marcia discussed, is that this arrives in an environment where there's been a long history of ebbs and flows in terms of Canadian engagement with sub-Saharan Africa. And Africans have obviously been very cognizant of this, and they watch these ebbs and flows, and they would be naturally skeptical of the degree to which this time is different. And I would, I can walk through the various moments of this, but for both Canadians and for Africans, this is a kind of show me moment, right? This is a moment when we have to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. And it remains to be seen whether this time will be different, and whether when we do, as we have now done, raise expectations, we will be prepared to stay the course. The third thing, and this is something that I've alluded to already, is the strategy is emerging in a world of, to state the obvious, great uncertainty and great anxiety. As the Prime Minister said when he was announcing his massive infusion of funds into defense, a darker, more competitive world. And in this context, there is naturally a kind of flight to safety, to the familiar and trusted friends and allies. We hear this talk a lot in both security and economic relations. And this has certainly been the pattern of the most prominent travel and announceable so far. So this is about diversification, which is really, though, framed in a relatively narrow understanding of diversification towards non-American, but still Western and Asia Pacific partners and allies. And so the question is, where does the Africa strategy fit into this context, and why should it be prioritized? And I would say broadly that there are both self-interested and collective interest-based motivations for why this should be an important priority of this Canadian government. And really the point here is obviously what the current moment for Canadians has highlighted is the degree to which we have been over-dependent on a very narrow set of relationships, particularly within North America, and the tremendous imperative of diversifying those relationships. And the diversification that's been talked about thus far has largely focused on familiar, well-worn patterns of rebuilding relationships or building on the relationships with Europe and the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region. And my premise, and I think the point that would need to be made very strongly, is that investing in relations with Africa is an investment in the future, the long-term future, because there is a limited upside in the end to returning to traditional friends and trusted allies. And whereas the potential upside in the African context is much greater. That's a long-term project. It has to be, so this picks up on a point that Thomas made, it has to be invested in a sustained and systematic way, which is what we have failed to do in the past, frankly. And this is a moment and an opportunity to try to move in a more sustained direction. So that's point one. The other is that many of the ultimately kind of existential global collective action challenges that we face can only be faced in partnership with African societies, African governments, African commercial interlocutors. So issues related to environmental sustainability, issues related to global health, issues related to migration, issues related to humanitarian intervention, all of these things, or humanitarian supports, all of these things have to be undertaken in collaboration with, informed by African partners, if they're going to be collectively met. So that's and really, in short, we cannot be secure and prosperous while neglecting the place where both opportunities and challenges are most important, most urgent, most pressing. So that's the kind of why we should be engaged. What would a serious strategy look like? And actually, and this is where we get into the kind of the question of how we elaborate on how we improve what's there. And I guess I would start out by saying that there are lots of things that we would want to see, including concrete resource commitments. But the first thing is to actually operationalize the things that are already in the strategy. So that there are actually some promising directions that have been mooted, but it's a question of seeing how they're put into practice, what kinds of resources are put into them, and how they're operationalized. And obviously, the diaspora engagement mechanism that has been mooted and alluded to is a really, really important marker of what emerges. For me, as someone who's been studying Canadian African relations for a long time, for more than 30 years, it's one of the most striking and most important changes is the emergence of a really, as Sheikh suggested earlier, a really high-powered African diaspora that has the capacity to be an enormous asset in terms of building more durable relationships. How will that be done? How will it be sustained? How will that expertise and those connections, and I take Thomas's point, these connections are trans-societal. How will they be built upon and developed? What will an African trade hub look like, and how will it be operationalized? Cheryl Urban said earlier that this was in motion. I'll look forward to seeing more and hearing more about how it's being operationalized. When will we see a high-level trade mission focusing on innovative sectors? What will that look like? And what will it be? What will it lead to? In other words, this is not about one high-level trade mission. It's about a kind of Team Canada approach that we would see repeated in a variety of contexts and a variety of areas of the continent. A kind of underlying question is how will a strategic focus on Africa be supported in terms of bureaucratic structures and resources? Really, one of the things that is potentially really important is moving beyond the relatively narrow siloed structure of the way in which Canada has engaged with Africa historically towards one in which the different and interdependent sectoral linkages in terms of trade and economic relations, in terms of development cooperation, in terms of migration, in terms of diplomacy, are actually brought into a kind of collective strategic undertaking. And the connections between them are drawn upon and understood. So this is about a kind of intersectoral, multidisciplinary team structure that needs to be built within government, and I would say needs to be supported beyond government. That there needs to be a reconstitution, if you like, of the Canadian security and development policy ecosystem that used to exist in Ottawa and was largely dismantled over the course of the last 20 years. So this is an investment in the knowledge capacity, the specialized knowledge capacity that's required to make smart policy in relation to Africa, to build sustained relationships, as Thomas has suggested. That will be really, really important. This is going to maybe potentially be a little controversial, but I also want to make a plea for why in this moment of uncertainty we need to reinvest and recommit to development cooperation, not in the traditional form that it's often taken, but as a mechanism for intentional engagement with particularly important and acute needs. I say this partly because of the retreat, frankly, that is taking place in relation to the development cooperation regime globally, starting with USAID, but not mirrored by what's happening in the United Kingdom and Germany and many other major donors. And I would say that a commitment to re-engaging or reinvesting or recommitting to development cooperation in a way that stresses reciprocity, mutuality, responsiveness to the priorities of Africans is a sign of being a trusted and reliable partner with African governments and African communities. So those are some of the key markers of what we could look for. The last thing that I should say, or that I want to talk about, is what should be avoided. And what I want to suggest here is what I would really like to see us downplay in this latest iteration of Canadian engagement with Africa is the sort of ritual invocation of Canadian leadership. One of the things that we always want to do is we always want to claim that we're not just present, but we are leaders. And a lot of times what we need is not necessarily leaders, or at least not leaders who are wanting to signal their own prominence, but rather leaders that are prepared to lead collaboratively. So this is, as I say, a moment for walking the walk, for showing Africans the seriousness of this engagement, the sustained character of this engagement, rather than invoking, as the strategy does, some rather remote, older examples of Canadian leadership that have not been, as Marcia suggested, part of the landscape of the Canadian engagement with Africa for much of the last generation. So this is a time for action. It's a time for showing ourselves and our partners that we're serious and moving away from ritual invocations of our own importance. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Merci. Merci beaucoup, Professeur Black. I will n'ont pas beaucoup de temps maintenant, donc je demanderai aux autres intervenants de se limiter aux 8 minutes recommandées, s'il vous plaît. Et merci beaucoup, Professeur Black. Et Professeur Nadège, qui parle? You know her? Oh, okay.
Merci beaucoup, Sheikh. Bonjour tout le monde. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I hope that my voice will make it through. I've been coughing a little bit. But thank you very much for inviting me to this important conversation. And thank you to all the organizers and hosts for putting it together. Since we do have 8 minutes, I want to try and see if I can make it. My points will speak to strategy number 2 on enhancing economic cooperation, excuse me, and strategy number 3 on reducing poverty, supporting economic development, empowering the youth, and assisting in humanitarian crisis and climate adaptation. I want to really focus on the mining sector specifically. We know that outside the African continent, basically after South Africa's intracontinental mining investments, Canada has had the largest mining presence in Africa with over $37 billion in mining assets on the continent. So I think for me, the strategic importance of mining both in Africa and in Canada is an important focus of this strategy. And so rethinking the current terms of these partnerships with mineral-rich African countries, including in regions such as the Sahel region, given that beyond economic dimensions, there are direct implications regarding peace and security issues, both for intra and interstate conflicts. So to me, the growing importance, obviously, of critical minerals. Sorry, I'm having an echo. Is everyone hearing me okay?
Yeah,
okay.
It's okay.
All right. So beyond the economic side of things, critical minerals specifically for renewable energy, which also means direct implications for environmental justice, economic development, and then also complex conflicts. Countries with important critical minerals reserves, such as the DRC especially, which has the largest cobalt reserve in the world, will also need more important bilateral diplomatic focus. But beyond the mining sector, but very much directly impacting its governance, Canada has formed or negotiated about 60 bilateral investment treaties worldwide, and about 1/3 of all of them are with African countries. So this observation is part of a working co-authored paper that I have with my colleague at the University of Saskatchewan, Professor Odumusu Ayanu. And I'm mentioning this to point to the fact that bilateral investment treaties in Canada, which are known as Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Agreements, FIPAs in short, which are also highlighted in the strategy for good reason, because the strategy points out that Canada currently has FIPAs in force within 8 African countries. But the thing is, as the name suggests, under international law, the primary goal of these FIPAs have been by design foreign capital protection. So in other words, it's not primarily concerned with protecting host states. And in this case, host African states have often been at the short end of the stick in signing agreements under serious information and power asymmetry and enduring long-term consequences when corporate claims are brought in. So to me, this is really essentially, I have one core point, which is that rethinking Canada's mining partnership with Africa means truly rethinking the wider investment structures that Canada promotes. And so there needs to be a serious development of a more cohesive vision for the strategy for mining governance partnership with the African continent beyond the economic returns that we've been focused on. And I think this is where I would like to see the strategy, which, as we said, is supposed to be a working document, be more systematically guided by environmental and human rights considerations. And this would require more collaboration with and more regulation of, and I think that's obviously the sticky point, Canadian-based corporate actors in Africa. And I should point out that in this case, obviously, Canada is not alone, Africa is not alone. There's a lot of parallels with regions such as Latin America, for instance. So there isn't necessarily a need to sort of have this isolationist partnership as well. And there are already a lot of existing regional global standards that Canada can deepen its partnerships with, such as the Africa Mining Vision and the World Bank's Extractive Industries Review. So essentially, I think one of my maybe perhaps more concrete suggestions, which comes from a lot of international lawyers within Canada, such as Sarah Seck at Dalhousie University, is to actually take the concept of home state responsibility very seriously when it comes to Canada's mining presence in Africa. And this would involve renewed trust, equity and engagement, equal partnership. And I think I won't say anything new in saying that trust towards the West in general within African countries has been very shaky recently, and that includes Canada, even though we don't like to face this reality too much. But I think it's important to focus on that and then focus on what it could actually mean to have a home state responsibility more seriously. I don't know whether my 8 minutes are up, but I do want to end with one final point that has actually been taken up by various people so far, including David just now, about what it means to be a leader. And I think speaking of youth empowerment, I think most of us know that some of the most popular leaders in Africa right now, and in popular imaginations, I think historically, are a lot of the young military leaders, thinking about the Sahel region. And I think we need to take that very seriously in understanding that a big part of the appeal of these leaders is the sentiment that there is a reclaiming of African agency to be true partners with partners that were formerly relying on colonial ties and perhaps more paternalistic attitudes. So the idea of actually listening and learning as a way towards partnership is not just discourse. I think it's extremely important. And especially also the idea of actual change and action, which many people have already talked about as well. But to end on a perhaps, I guess, a more promising note, I do want to acknowledge that this is not something that Canada is not aware of. There has been the deployment in the past of a Canada corporate social responsibility strategy in 2009 and 2014. So we're very much aware of a lot of these issues in the mining sector of Canada abroad, and of course the necessary links between the Canadian government and Canadian mining companies. But in terms of implementation and in terms of what that means concretely, it's not been quite clear. So I think there needs to be a going back to a lot of these existing initiatives and trying to form a more cohesive vision, a more follow-through approach, if we will, that's implementable and implemented. So I will stop here and I look forward to the conversation in the Q&A. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Nadège. Merci surtout d'avoir fait cette connexion avec le thème qui a été débattu par le professeur Black. Et je crois que c'est un peu le même domaine. On va du général au particulier. Merci d'avoir attiré l'attention surtout sur ce secteur minier qui semble être quelquefois un peu délaissé entre le Canada et l'Afrique et qui a besoin d'une attention particulière compte tenu de la situation particulière du secteur minier en Afrique. Thank you so much, and I'm sure we will get some more questions that you will have to answer. The next, our next speaker is Dr. Adetun from Vancouver.
From where?
And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I thank the Africa Study Group for organizing this, and I will go straight into my presentation. The last speaker touched upon the question of extractive industries in Africa, so I will not spend too much time on that. And in my presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the things she talked about, broadly speaking, in terms of reducing poverty, supporting economic development, and empowering youth. And I've started my discussion. I'll send you the PowerPoint later, looking at the context and trends in which we are examining this Canada's Africa strategy. I think it heralds a period of greater intentionality, as one of the earlier speakers had mentioned, post-British Empire and American imperialism. It seems to herald a new era in global cooperation and partnerships. The context in which we are right now, with America asserting America First, so-called America First policies, is one in which Canada is then called upon, and hopefully will rise to the occasion, to emphasize how much the global economy is interconnected, and in fact, beyond economic interconnectedness, how much it is socially interconnected as well, even though that often seems to lag behind. Supply chains are completely interconnected in many spheres, and even labor is a cross-border input. It is not, and yet we are trying to impose stringent human tariffs whilst opposing economic tariffs. I think these are all things that need to be rethought as we look at the Canada-Africa strategy and some of the recent government policies, even relating to immigration in Canada. In terms of reducing poverty and supporting economic development, as the earlier speaker, the speaker just before me had alluded to, looking at the Canada's Africa strategy, it talks about prioritizing the mobilization of finance. I have pointed out in my presentation that beyond this, critical to reducing poverty are fair terms of trade and eliminating unjust and unsustainable debt. And I think we would all have heard a little bit more about this in the preparation for the G7 meeting under the umbrella of the Jubilee 2025 campaign, which is in relation to debt, eliminating unjust and unsustainable debt. This is absolutely critical to address, reforming the global financial system to prevent this kind of debt crisis in which so many African countries find themselves spending far more on debt servicing than they are on development. Also, beyond these micro-level interventions, whether through nonprofit organizations or NGOs that emphasize things like microcredit, various schemes for the empowerment of women, I think we have to address these macro-level trends, which I have alluded to in terms of fundamental structural change within the global system, both in terms of governance of global institutions such as the UN, including the Security Council, but also in terms of the way in which resources are deployed in the implementation of this strategy. I'd also like to touch briefly on the whole question of Canada's, because it's mentioned in the Canada-Africa strategy, Canada's FIA and those kinds of policies that are major aspects of Canada's foreign policy, and emphasize the need for them to be implemented in consultation and in partnership with the African partners that are being engaged with, because only in that context can we talk about their relevance to implementation of this strategy. So, for example, in the area of environmental, in the area so-called of climate justice, climate change, I think in the African context, we have to think a lot more about what I might term environmental aspects of ecological crisis. So we see a whole lot of ecological crisis on the African continent, including drought and the impact of drought. And some of these crises are actually triggered as a result of the ways in which over very many decades, international development has been taking place. It is related also sometimes to extractive industry. It's related to changing the ways in which people locally, indigenous people, actually interface and interact with nature. And so very much more of an emphasis needs to be put on the environmental impacts of these ecological crises. So sometimes people say, oh, Africa is not taking seriously the whole question of climate justice, climate change. I think for local people, it is much more, they are taking it seriously because they are seeing major ecological crises and are having to deal with them. What is needed then in terms of support, and hopefully the implementation of the strategy will address this, is more respect for indigenous knowledge in collaboration with more modern scientific kinds of knowledge in order to tackle these crises. And there are many, many movements on the African continent now that are assessing indigenous knowledge, that are trying to apply indigenous knowledge in terms of giving greater emphasis to biodiversity, for example. I've been involved in quite a number of them in Southern Africa, but also in Nigeria, that are looking at how to protect our local biodiversity in the face of so much advancing of genetic engineering in terms of the agricultural sector. So these are all things that need to be emphasized a great deal more when we actually come to the implementation of the Africa strategy. I think another issue I would like to touch on quickly is the question of what I would term human security, and the need to emphasize much more human security. And this relates also to the attitude towards youth and investing in youth, which is talked about and highlighted in the Africa strategy. African youth don't want to leave home, and many actually want to go back if they have had to leave. And so a critical issue is democratic governance and human rights. What are the conditions that are driving this attempt by youth to leave the continent? And what needs to be done to stop it? I think a massive investment in youth, which is talked about in the Africa strategy, is needed, but we need to look in more detail at what kinds of investments are we talking about. In the area of democratic governance and human rights, I think much more than an emphasis on militarization or increasing military spending, what is needed there is investing in youth in terms of education so that they can actually have a much stronger input in democratic governance. As we have seen in many countries, and as someone just alluded to in terms of certain kinds of popular or populist governments, they are very much young people. And so if we are looking at how to improve the security situation in Africa, I think we have to take into account the power of people, and the majority of the population is youthful. I was recently talking to a friend of mine about the situation, for example, in the Sahel, and case in point being Burkina Faso, where there is an attempt to deal with the situation with, let me call them militant groups that are fundamentalist, religious fundamentalism, that really, at the end of the day, you're fighting almost a losing battle. If you look at Boko Haram, whether you look at the fundamentalists in Burkina Faso, no amount of military intervention will succeed unless you have large numbers of people, the local people, in a position to resist these groups, because the groups are actually pretty small groups of organized cadres in a sense. So if they are resisted by local communities, they would not succeed. But the ability of local communities to resist them requires much greater investment in education, which is why they are always attacking education, and which is why many anti-democratic African governments also attack advances in education. So this is really a very important thing to take into account when we talk about investing in youth. And it goes beyond our usual thoughts concerning education. We have to take another look at African education. Somebody talked about the universities. We have to take another look at what impact the universities have, what is being taught, it's relevant to local development. So I think that when we start to address substantive issues relating to the implementation of the Africa strategy, these are all things that need to be taken into account so that it's not just business as usual. I would like to conclude by saying that in implementing the strategy, we need the active engagement by all stakeholders. And as has been pointed out, the African diaspora, certain sections of the African diaspora are very important stakeholders and should not be ignored. They should be given the opportunity to be consulted, as we're doing now, as well as to actively be involved in the implementation of the strategy. Again, I would like to reiterate and to emphasize that fundamental structural reforms are needed at the bilateral and multilateral levels. And the prior speaker just talked about the kinds of reforms, some of the kinds of reforms that are needed in terms of investment, foreign direct investment in Africa. The strategy talks a lot about free trade zones, talks about the Africa Free Trade Zone, etc. But we have to ask the question, What about the regulation of free trade zones? I did some study of the regulation of the Lekki Peninsula Free Trade Zone in Nigeria. And it was amazing that at that time, this would be about 2010, the government was literally advertising its concessions to foreign corporations. And when I finished giving a presentation on this, the number of concessions and the way in which they were phrased, the audience at that time, I was at the University of Western Ontario in the law department, and they were like, so what's in it for the local people? And I think this is the point that was being made by the earlier speaker. So we have to question the way in which free trade zones are established and the nature of their regulation. The regulation of corporations generally is a big issue in the context of Africa. Corporate social responsibility has to be advanced, has to be talked about a lot more. This is not being against private investment, so to speak. This is not a debate about private versus public intervention. It is about monopoly, oligopoly, and the misuse and abuse of power. And we're seeing that very graphically in the United States, for example, in terms of intervention in governance and democratic governance. So I think these are issues and lessons to be learned, that if Canada is finally stepping up, has an African strategy, when it is time for implementation of that strategy, it has to go beyond business as usual and look at the whole question of building partnerships, which is part of the title of this workshop, the whole question of global cooperation and new partnerships, respect for the partners, and indeed justice in terms of access to justice, both economic justice and social justice. So I hope that we will constantly bear this in mind when we're discussing the implementation of the African strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toon. And I think it's very important that you talk about the issue of creating more legal norms in order to have a kind of regulations. And I trust this is one of the area where the strategy will have to focus and to be fully implemented. Canada has a lot of experience in that domain, and I think it could be a kind of transfer of technology towards the African countries, framework of implementation of the strategy. Merci. And our last speaker is Professor Akufo. I'm sorry that we know that you are in Accra, but we thought that this thematic is one of the most important area that has been stressed, emphasized in between the strategy, and people are waiting for your presentation. If you can help us keeping it for 8 minutes, we will try to extend our session by 15 other minutes. And the floor is yours.
I hope you can hear me. Please, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you very well from Ghana.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, Dr. Bangura. And I would like to also, just like my co-presenters, to thank the Paterson School of International Affairs, the Canadian African Diaspora Scholars Network, and of course to thank sincerely the African Study Group, which put all this together. I've been asked to talk about peace and security. I will focus on that. But before that, I would like to pass some general comments on the strategy in itself. It is always a privilege and honor really to He's sitting on the same panel with Professor David Black. Professor David Black was my PhD external examiner. And while he was talking, this was back in 2010, when he thought that, I've done enough to get a PhD. So I always blame him for, everything that has happened afterwards. When he was talking, he said that he can't remember, how long that he studied Canadian foreign policy for a very long time. In fact, he's such a colossus of, knowledge when it comes to Canadian foreign policy, and I always defer to his leadership in this, area. For my own time of, studying Canada-Africa relations, as an MBA student at Brock University in 2002, when I first came to Canada. So this September will be exactly 23 years that I've spent in Canada. I have lived in Canada. I've studied this relationship. And there has never been a time.
Beaucoup de réflexions, des lumières dans l'écran.
There has never been a time that Canada-Africa relations has gained so much momentum and has been discussed. Since I've lived in Canada for this period, that in the past 2 years there have been many sessions and parliamentary studies and all that. And here we are with the Africa strategy. This strategy, in my view, is path-breaking. It is path-breaking in the sense that it has really set the path or the agenda for how Canada is going to relate with the African continent, breaking away from business as usual and moving forward to a more meaningful, partnership with African states. Now, it is not a perfect document, as some of my panelists, have highlighted. But what is important, in my view, is that this strategy should not be seen as something that has been put in place as a response only to what I would term as temporary shifts, perhaps in global politics, or especially in our relationship with the United States, for example. But rather, it should be seen that we are able to come to some kind of consensus to agree that it is necessary, that it is important that Canada has this document, because Africa is important in its own right, not because of just shifts that are happening at the global and of course at the continental level in North America. So because this is very important, because when Marcia was talking, she mentioned Robert Fowler, whom of course I had the honor of interviewing when I was writing my PhD dissertation. These are champions who have championed the Canada-Africa relations. But these champions, as we know, are not going to remain forever. It is therefore important that we institutionalize this relationship, we institutionalize this policy, so it doesn't become episodic. It doesn't, become a project of a particular political party, and that it becomes an essential element of Canadian consciousness that Africa is important in and of its right, that we need to embrace Africa as is, because it possesses lots of opportunity for Canadian, engagement. Now, relating to peace and security, specifically, the strategy provides an excellent summary of the security challenges on the African continent. In fact, I would have loved to see that in the G7 summit coming up next week, that Africa was somehow mentioned specifically in the core the three core missions that the Prime Minister has laid out. But the first one about protecting our cities and the well-being and the well-being of the world clearly is fits into the peace and security aspect of the African strategy. So my hope is that more emphasis will be given to that on the African about Africa during the G7 summit. Now I'm looking at my time here and I have just about 6 minutes, so I'll highlight about two important areas. I think that when it comes to peace and security, that the Canadian government actually need not to reinvent the wheel. Need not to reinvent the wheel in the sense that Canada has a niche in the area of peacekeeping. Canada has a niche in this particular area, and that we need to go back to these and try to come to understand how we can revamp peacekeeping operations on the African continent. In fact, in that regard, Canada should and must support African-led peace operations, especially helping to rebuild or resource the peacekeeping centers of excellence, such as the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center, which Canada helped to establish, and of course the Abuja War College, among others. But also in the area of peacekeeping is how Canada can also think about how it can take leadership when it comes to NATO operations on the African continent. Like for instance, how can we sustain this engagement in a way that will give a human face to the operations that NATO engage in on the African continent? I think that Canada has the credibility to provide that engagement. Now, lastly, as I'm trying to say within the 8 minutes here, is that Canada needs to think about providing leadership in revamping the Kimberley process certification scheme. I call it Kimberley process 2.0. This is very important in the sense that when you look at the African continent, illegal or mining activities or illicit trade in natural resources contributes to funding all kinds of criminal activities, as well as terrorism on the continent, which threaten security on the African continent. I think that Canada can provide leadership in this area. It has done it before with the partnership of African states, and this is a clear opportunity for Canada to really think about this and to sustain this relationship going forward. So in conclusion, I think that this strategy is a great example of how Canada can reshape its relationship with the African continent. It is a milestone, a significant milestone. It's a path-breaking document. Its implementation will require a lot of resources and a lot of hours to be spent. But we can achieve all these if it is embedded within the conscience of the Canadian public. The Canadian public has to buy into this. It doesn't have to become an episodic document. A document that will only gather dust after one government leaves power and another government comes in. But that Canadians themselves will come to realize the importance of the African continent in global politics, in global geostrategy, and to think more deeply about sustaining this relationship. I think I'm going to end here and wait for your comments and your questions. Thank you so very much.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Professor Akufo. And thank you for taking time to stay awake. It's now, I think, 9 o'clock there, p.m. And also thank you to Nadej, who is in France. There are 6 hours difference between us. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you for your insights that will certainly allow Canada-Africa strategy implemented to be strengthened. And thank you for your comments. We have now only 30 minutes, unfortunately, for the questions. I will ask our dear panelists to look into the Q&A box. And Nadej, si vous voulez bien voir les questions qui sont en français. and to see how you can answer them. Meanwhile, I will ask the audience here, if you have any questions, please feel free.
I'll be the guinea pig and go first.
Yeah, good. If you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Richard Remier. I've written as an informed academic back before my government service and for lots of work in the private sector on Africa and African policy, the failures of Canada's African policy. So I'm going to be a bit of a skunk at a tea party and a couple, I think, challenging things, not with the purpose of being racist, but to stimulate some thought. Number one, I think what I haven't heard so far is any details about what this strategy, everybody loves strategy, how it will be judged, what the success metrics are, measurable, quantifiable by time. So how do we know, we got this great document now, if it's working or if it's not working? When do we pull the plug and say, no, not working, time for something else? That's number one. Number two, I think one of the challenges is with 54 countries diverse across the continent from top to bottom, I think we're making a mistake to focus on Africa as a whole. And what we should be doing is picking half a dozen of the most promising Canada countries in which to focus our diplomatic, economic, trade, and investment activities. Leave it to other better qualified people than me to pick those countries, but we can probably come to some consensus here. But pick, if we focus on Africa as a whole, as a country, as Canada, then the slowest part of the train will determine how fast the whole exercise can go. And so that's number two. And the last point, and you've been very generous with your time, is for civil society, I think one of the missing parts, Canada's outreach, has been the role of churches in Canada in developing, strengthening, and getting better intelligence and information about what's actually happening. So on a personal basis, the church that I belong to has sponsored a girls' school, secondary school in Lesotho, and has sponsored several families that have come in from Sudan, which is a challenging multi-year process with the immigration department. So I would emphasize with government as part of its strategy, what can this key part of Canadian life and African life, churches, bring to the party? So thank you.
We will take another question. Maybe Cameron, if you can read the first question, the first question that we are receiving in English from the people online.
Yeah, sure.
Then we will let our panelists answer them.
I'll try to be loud as well. First question online is, how do you envision the Canada-Africa strategy's focus on diversifying investments and improving supply chain resiliency impacting local African economies and communities, particularly in terms of job creation and sustainable development?
Thank you. So I would suggest after Professor Chieko, Thomas, and Professor Black, that you try to deal with those two questions.
Okay, I'm happy to take a stab at this question. My sense, and maybe I'm a very uninformed, and somehow maybe naive optimist, but I have I am very optimistic that if we have a proper Canadian engagement on the African continent, particularly on trade, it can improve both job creation as well as economic development, sustainable economic development on the African continent. And I'm picking on a couple of them. I think as a country, we have enormous capacity in the area of agro-businesses. And we know very well that agro-business, small scale, small to medium-term businesses, they dominate the African scene. And therefore, having a stronger Canada-Africa relationship can help nurture or can help build and scale up these small-scale industry in the agro-food business. And we know that majority of Africans, that's where they work. It's not in the formal sector. So that's one area that I think that we have enormous capacity. I also think that we also have enormous experience that we can share in terms of how you help or work with the African countries to deal with some of the bottlenecks or challenges that we have internally. Part of the reason why intra-Africa trade is very low, still around 15%. Part of it has to do with the fact that although we have all these wonderful legal documents, in practice at the borders, particularly women are harassed, women are often not able to do it, and a lot of this trade is often channeled through women. So Canada working in partner based on our experience working with the US and others can really help and work with the African country concretely on a practical level, remove some of the challenges that Africa traders implement. And then the last one is on the area of infrastructure. Everyone talks about China's involvement and others, but one of the reasons you find that in terms of scaling up of China's investment is often slower than it should be has to do with the fact sometimes they lack the kind of the technical service provision, right? Engineering, and so on and so forth. This is a kind of service in terms of big infrastructure development. That is a kind of service that we will be able to work with the African countries and ensuring that they will be able to absorb some of the investment when it comes to creating transnational infrastructure that can facilitate trade and create more jobs on the African continent. So thank you so much. And also in Canada here.
Thank you, Professor Blake.
Thomas has done an admirable job of responding to that question. Sheikh, do you want me to deal with the first set of questions as well?
Yeah, the first question.
Yeah. On this question about supply chains and sustainable development, I think the only thing that I would add is that this it will be, I think, to link the two questions together, one of the metrics by which this strategy is measured, because historically, Canadian engagement with Africa has been has paid relatively little attention to commercial opportunities or to economic opportunities beyond the extractive sector. It's one of the reasons why trade and investment links remain at a relatively low level, and it has a lot to do with, I think, frankly, the two things: the culture of the Canadian private sector and the degree to which Canadian trade commissioners and policy arms that are engaged with supporting and promoting private sector activity have neglected Africa. And so one of the key metrics, I think, by which this study should be measured is the degree to which there's an investment in creating understanding, expertise to support a more diversified approach to building economic relationships with Africa. I think that just to circle back very quickly to the first set of questions, I think the point about metrics is one of the key critiques that's been made of this document, is that there are it's aspirational, but there are no metrics that would define success, and I think that's one of the key ways in which it needs to be amplified and built upon. And on this question of focusing on a handful of key countries, I guess I would say that I think that is a part of this strategy, especially as it pertains to the whole range of economic, diplomatic, and other relationships, that there will be a relatively small number of key partners that we should invest in. But that when we think about the array of challenges the continent faces as a whole, that you need to have regional as well as country-specific dimensions to the strategy. And I just on churches, I would say that this is a really interesting point. This is one of the big changes that I've seen in the course of my engagement with African policy issues, is that the Canadian historic churches were historically a very important, although not uncontroversial, site of trans-societal linkages with the African context, and their relative demise, or not the decline, has weakened that connection.
Thank you so much. Back to Ottawa here, we have another question.
My name is Andrea Pierce, and I'm with Immigrants Can, and I used to be the inaugural executive director of the Black Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub here at Carleton University. And my question is, looking at other models, like for example, if we use China as an example, and the growth of China and the involvement of diaspora, and how China, as an integral part of their trade policy in the past and even currently, they've used knowledge transfer as a key deliverable to help build and transfer that knowledge. Not that Africa doesn't have that knowledge, because of very highly educated people, and some of the Black Canadian highest educated people are from Africa. But given that model that we can learn from and benchmark, and how we can increase our learning curve by taking some examples of things that have happened before, including, for example, the Indo-Pacific strategy, the funding, even the model and framework that's already been built. In fact, they report directly to Parliament every year. Correct? I see you're nodding your head that you agree. And there's funding and support for that. I just worked on the international trade discussion for the alternate federal budget, and I brought up the Canada-Africa strategy as we're talking about diversification right now of Canada's trade footprint, given all the issues with the US and how urgent that is right now. And so could we talk a little bit about that? One, about the opportunity, the knowledge transfer, lessons learned from other successful models that have been done by Canada, for example, with the Indo-Pacific strategy, and how China has done in the past.
Any insight from the panelists? I would say maybe,
Hi.
Yeah, Nadesh.
I was just gonna take a quick stab, because I think there's another question that was related to it, about if you allow me to read quickly. It was from someone called Issa Savadgo Seidu. They had asked, on behalf of the youth in Africa, how do we trust this partnership and policies to be mutual and also benefit the majority of the people, and not remain within government agencies for political manipulation? And to me, the current question actually is very tied to that, because it's asking us to consider models such as China's model as a best practice. And I do think it's an important one to look at, because one of the reasons why China has been very appealing on the continent is sort of moving away from the paternalistic ties and then focusing on just, business only. But I think one of the other pitfalls is continuing to ignore human rights abuses and environmental rights abuses if you're thinking about specific sectors. So I think I wanted to tie them back together to just say that I think it's good to follow best practices, but I think it's also important to see what pitfalls are in seemingly exciting newer partnerships, because we see that especially with the populist countries strengthening their ties with Russia as well. There are obviously also some limits there when it comes to, again, more human rights abuses, for instance. So I think that's, I don't know whether it's not fully answering the question, but I just wanted to say that there's some caution to be had there. And then specifically relating to how can we trust, for instance, Canada, as opposed to, you know, if you think about Francophone countries shunning France, for instance, and perhaps being more in bed with China and Russia, what is the difference? And my answer is that we don't know yet whether there is a difference unless we move beyond that discourse into concrete action. And if you think about specific investments on the ground where corporations are actually physically on the continent, one of the biggest and continuing issues for all of the examples mentioned, whether it's, you know, formerly France and in most of the Francophone spaces, or China or Russia, one of the biggest issues is local content not actually being addressed, and people not seeing that investments are coming, having an actual return on the ground. And countries having interesting ways around that. So I think I would just reiterate my concern that government and corporations actually need to be linked a lot more systematically, and that the government needs to be a lot more involved in some of these companies abroad. So I will stop here because I see that there's a hand to contribute as well.
Okay, that was me.
Yes.
And I just wanted to address some of the issues that have been raised in terms of this question of trust that was raised just now. The earlier speaker who had talked about the churches, because Canada has sort of been known, or it has been more publicized, Canada's role both in extractive industries, that's the corporations, private sector, but the other side was the humanitarian assistance. And this Canada tends to get involved when there has been actual humanitarian emergencies, conflict, and then it's about immigration, it's about refugees, it's about humanitarian assistance in terms of food and other kinds of aid. But I think the thing that the Canada-Africa strategy needs to address now is changing some of those relationships in the interest of sustainability. And so when you talk about the role of churches, I would not belittle their role by any chance, building schools, making donations, but I think at the macro level, what is required is a change in the relationship, and to go beyond missionary kinds of assistance and approaches to more sustainable partnerships, which is what the strategy claims to be addressing. So I think that would be my response to the question of the role of the church, that really the very attitudes with which the church intervenes need to change. They need to they need to put more emphasis on partnerships as opposed to some sort of missionary approach, which is actually disempowering or disabling of local kinds of initiatives. So I think this is a really important thing to remember in refocusing Canada-Africa relations. In relation to the question of job creation, sustainable development, and government accountability, I agree to some extent that yes, the Canadian government needs to do more regulation of the extractive industry. It needs to invest more, as I think one of the earlier speakers talked about, in supporting public institutions. But I think we should also remember that it needs to have a more values, what shall I call it? A values-based foreign policy, so that we are talking about holding these governments accountable. We cannot just say, okay, support public institutions. The reason why you had some groups step out of public institutions, establish or try to establish private ones, including think tanks, is precisely because of the dysfunction of some of those public institutions. It's not the answer. We need to reform them, but we need to address the general question of accountability. And the Canadian government, in its relationships with various African countries, in its assistance, its foreign assistance, needs to be aware of this and to have some sort of basis for its foreign policy that is anchored in values, in so-called democratic values that it espouses. I think we see this also in relation to the Canadian government's relationship with India and China, because we were earlier talking about precedents or different kinds of relationships, in the sense that Canada is a very diverse country. It now has a population that is drawn from so many parts of the world. Why sometimes then do we hear so much talk about foreign influence? What constitutes foreign influence? Why is European influence sometimes not considered foreign influence? I think we need to, in building genuine partnerships, talk about Canada's role in strengthening global citizenship, in strengthening multilateral relations, and Canada's approach to its own First Nations or Native people, because that in itself is what will, in part, inform its foreign policy. There is a fairly direct relationship, I think, between the way in which Canada treats its First Nations and the ways in which it will interact on the global stage. So I think there are new generations of Canadians coming up. It's a very diverse country. And we're going to see interactions between these new Canadian youth and youth, for example, in Africa. What will be the terms of that interaction is partly what we're talking about. And in the implementation of this Canada-Africa strategy, we are going to see that in reality when it comes to actually allocating resources to what the strategy says it wishes to achieve. That is where the rubber meets the road, in a sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the insight. We are almost at the end of our session now, and I would like to thank our panelists for your honest insight. Unfortunately, we have not been able to address all the questions, and I trust that our panelists will be able eventually to answer to some emails. I will try to forward those emails to you. It will be, as I said, this session has been recorded, and we will share it with everybody. I thank you very much. And depending on where you are, Akufo, good night in Accra. Nadej, good night in France, bonne nuit. And Professor Black, Toon, Thomas, thank you so much to each of you. It was a very brutal, but very honest session. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing, Sheikh.